The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the merchant vessel Seabreeze as Captain Marcus Thompson adjusted his binoculars for the third time in 10 minutes. Something felt different about this voyage, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The cargo manifest was routine enough: medical supplies bound for the island nation of Valdoria, a humanitarian mission that should have been straightforward. Yet an inexplicable tension hung in the salt air like fog refusing to lift. Thompson had been sailing these waters for over 20 years, ever since he left the Navy with an honorable discharge and a chest full of commendations. His weathered hands gripped the ship's wheel with the confidence of someone who had navigated through countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. The Seabreeze wasn't the largest vessel in his fleet, but she was reliable, and her crew of 12 had worked together long enough to function like a well-oiled machine. "Captain," called out his first mate, Diego Santos, as he climbed the steps to the bridge. "Weather Service is reporting some unusual activity about 50 nautical miles northeast of our position. Nothing severe enough to change course, but worth keeping an eye on." Thompson nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "What kind of activity?" "Radar interference, mostly. Could be atmospheric, but some of the other vessels in the area are reporting strange readings too." Santos paused, consulting his tablet. "There's also been some chatter on the emergency frequencies." "Nothing clear, just fragments." The captain's intuition, honed by decades at sea, began to prickle. In his experience, when multiple factors aligned to create an unusual situation, it was rarely coincidence. "Double-check our position and make sure all communications equipment is functioning properly. And, Santos, have the crew do a full safety check. Life jackets, emergency beacons, the works." As Santos departed to carry out these orders, Thompson remained on the bridge, studying the approaching weather system. The clouds weren't moving in the typical patterns he'd learned to read over the years. Instead of the predictable formations that preceded most storms, these seemed almost deliberately arranged, as if guided by some unseen force. Below deck, the crew went about their duties with practiced efficiency. Maria Gonzalez, the ship's engineer, monitored the engine room with the dedication of someone who understood that their lives depended on the mechanical heart of their vessel continuing to beat steadily. She'd noticed some minor fluctuations in the electrical systems over the past hour, nothing alarming enough to report to the captain yet, but worth watching. In the galley, cook Jonathan Park was preparing lunch for the crew when he noticed something odd through one of the small portholes. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a flash of light on the horizon, too brief and too bright to be lightning. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but saw only the normal interplay of sunlight and water. The Seabreeze continued on her course, cutting through moderately choppy seas with the steady rhythm that marked a well-maintained vessel. Her cargo hold contained more than just medical supplies, though the manifest didn't reflect this additional burden. Hidden among the legitimate shipment were several sealed containers that Thompson had agreed to transport as a personal favor to an old Navy contact. He'd asked no questions about their contents, and none had been volunteered. As the afternoon wore on, the weather began to deteriorate more rapidly than the forecasts had predicted. What had started as scattered clouds evolved into a more organized system, with winds picking up and the sea state becoming increasingly agitated. Thompson made the decision to adjust their heading slightly, aiming to skirt the worst of the developing storm while maintaining their schedule to Valdoria. It was during this course correction that Santos first spotted the other vessel. "Captain, we've got company," he announced, raising his binoculars. "About 3 miles off our starboard bow. Looks like a patrol boat, flying naval colors." Thompson took the offered binoculars and studied the approaching vessel. It was indeed a military craft, sleek and purposeful in its design, cutting through the waves with the efficiency that marked modern naval engineering. What troubled him was that no naval exercises had been announced for this area, and the boat seemed to be moving directly toward them with obvious intent. "Any response to our radio calls?" Thompson asked. "Nothing yet, sir. But they're definitely headed our way." The captain watched as the patrol boat continued to close the distance between them. In the old days, when he'd worn a naval uniform himself, such encounters were routine. Ships identified themselves, exchanged pleasantries, and went about their business. But something about this situation felt different, more urgent somehow. "Santos, get on the radio again. Use standard maritime frequencies and identify ourselves properly. Let them know we're a merchant vessel on a humanitarian mission with proper documentation." As his first mate returned to the radio equipment, Thompson continued to observe the approaching vessel through his binoculars. He could make out figures moving on the deck, though details were impossible to discern at this distance. What he could see clearly was that the boat was well armed and built for speed rather than cargo capacity. The radio crackled to life with Santos' voice. "Naval vessel approaching merchant ship Seabreeze, this is Captain Thompson. We are bound for Valdoria with medical supplies under proper international shipping documentation. Please identify yourself and state your intentions." For several long minutes, there was no response except the static of empty airwaves. The patrol boat continued its approach, now close enough that Thompson could see crew members on deck wearing what appeared to be combat gear. His unease deepened into something approaching alarm. Finally, the radio sparked to life with a crisp, authoritative voice. "Seabreeze, this is Commander Harrison of the naval patrol vessel Swift Current. You are ordered to stop engines and prepare for boarding. This is not a request." Thompson felt his pulse quicken. In all his years of merchant sailing, he'd been boarded for routine inspections several times, but never with such an aggressive tone or in circumstances like these. "Santos, ask them on what authority they're making this demand. We're in international waters with proper documentation." The response came quickly. "Seabreeze, you will comply immediately or face the consequences. Stop your engines and prepare to be boarded." Looking through his binoculars again, Thompson could now see that the patrol boat's weapons were manned and trained on his vessel. Whatever was happening here went far beyond a routine inspection. He had to make a decision that could affect not only his ship and cargo, but the lives of his crew. "All stop," he ordered reluctantly. "Santos, gather the crew on deck and make sure everyone understands to follow orders exactly. No heroics, no resistance. We'll sort this out through proper channels once we understand what's going on." As the Seabreeze came to a halt in the increasingly rough seas, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was connected to those sealed containers in his cargo hold. The favor he'd done for his old Navy contact might have just put his entire crew in danger. The patrol boat pulled alongside with military precision, and Thompson watched as armed personnel prepared to board his vessel. Whatever secrets those containers held, he suspected he was about to discover them whether he wanted to or not. The storm clouds continued to gather overhead, as if nature itself was responding to the tension building between the two ships. In the distance, barely visible through the deteriorating weather, another shape appeared on the horizon. Thompson adjusted his binoculars, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It looked like another vessel, larger than the patrol boat but moving with similar purpose. The situation was becoming more complicated by the minute, and he had the sinking feeling that his routine humanitarian mission had just become something far more dangerous. The boarding party was now securing lines between the two vessels, their movements efficient and professional. Thompson took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever questions were coming. In his years at sea, he'd learned that the truth, while not always convenient, was usually the safest course of navigation. He only hoped that principle would serve him well in whatever was about to unfold. As the first armed personnel stepped onto the deck of the Seabreeze, Thompson noticed something that made his blood run cold. These weren't just any naval personnel, their equipment and bearing suggested they were part of some sort of special operations unit. Whatever was in those sealed containers, it was important enough to warrant this level of response. The wind picked up further, and the first drops of rain began to fall, marking the arrival of the storm that had been building all day. Thompson wondered if the approaching weather would complicate whatever was about to happen, or if it might provide some sort of cover for what? He wasn't even sure what he hoped for at this point, only that his crew remained safe and that the truth, whatever it was, would eventually come to light. The commanding officer of the boarding party approached Thompson with purposeful strides, his hand resting casually but meaningfully on his sidearm. The captain of the Seabreeze straightened his shoulders and prepared to face whatever accusations or demands were coming his way, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the fate of his ship, his crew, and possibly much more than that. The commanding officer who stepped aboard the Seabreeze was younger than Captain Thompson had expected, but his bearing spoke of serious training and unwavering purpose. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison removed his helmet, revealing sharp features and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the merchant vessel with tactical precision. Captain Thompson, Morrison began without preamble, "We have reason to believe your vessel is carrying contraband materials that pose a significant security threat. We'll need to conduct a thorough search of your cargo hold and inspect all documentation." Thompson felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. "Commander, we're carrying medical supplies bound for Valdoria under proper humanitarian protocols. Our manifest is complete and our documentation is in order. I don't understand the nature of your concerns." "The nature of our concerns," Morrison replied coldly, "is classified. What I can tell you is that intelligence reports suggest your vessel may be transporting materials that could be used in the manufacture of weapons of mass destruction. We take such matters extremely seriously." The words hit Thompson like a physical blow. Weapons of mass destruction? He thought about those sealed containers his old Navy contact had asked him to transport, containers he'd agreed to carry without asking questions. His loyalty to a former comrade might have just made him an unwitting accomplice to something terrible. "Commander, I give you my word as a former naval officer that I have no knowledge of any weapons materials aboard this vessel. If there's something in my cargo that shouldn't be there, then I've been deceived, and I want to know about it as much as you do." Morrison's expression shifted slightly, registering surprise at learning of Thompson's military background. "You served?" 22 years in the Navy. Retired as a commander myself before going into merchant shipping." Thompson met Morrison's gaze steadily. "If there's a threat aboard my ship, I want it identified and removed immediately. My crew's safety is my primary concern." While this exchange was taking place on deck, below in the cargo hold, the boarding party's search team was working methodically through the stacked containers and pallets of medical supplies. Petty Officer Lisa Chang led the search with the thoroughness of someone trained to find things that others had tried very hard to hide. Her handheld detection equipment was already picking up some unusual readings from one section of the hold. "Sir," Chang called over her radio, "I'm getting some interesting signatures from the portside storage area. Might want to take a look at this." Meanwhile, unbeknownst to everyone aboard both vessels, a third party was observing the entire proceedings through high-powered optics from the larger ship that had appeared on the horizon. Dr. Sarah Chen lowered her binoculars and frowned, studying the scene unfolding several miles away. The timing of this interception was suspicious, coming just as her own mission was reaching its critical phase. Dr. Chen was no ordinary passenger on the research vessel Deep Explorer. Officially, she was a marine biologist studying unusual currents in this part of the ocean. Unofficially, she was investigating reports of illegal dumping by military contractors, waste that could have catastrophic environmental and security implications if it fell into the wrong hands. "Captain Rodriguez," she called to the skipper of the research vessel, "we need to move closer to those ships. Something's not right about this situation." Captain Elena Rodriguez had been working with Dr. Chun for 6 months and had learned to trust the scientist's instincts. There was more to Dr. Chen than her official credentials suggested, though Rodriguez had never pried into exactly what that might be. The research missions they'd undertaken together had a way of intersecting with matters of national security in ways that seemed too frequent to be coincidental. Back aboard the Seabreeze, the search team had located the sealed containers that Thompson's Navy contact had asked him to transport. Chang's detection equipment was now registering readings that made her blood run cold. The signatures suggested radioactive materials, possibly enriched uranium or plutonium compounds. "Commander Morrison," Chang's voice crackled over the radio with barely controlled urgency, "you need to get down here immediately. We've found what we're looking for, and it's worse than we thought." Morrison's face darkened as he listened to his subordinate's report. He turned to Thompson with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Captain, you're going to need to explain how weapons-grade nuclear materials ended up in your cargo hold." Thompson felt the deck seem to shift beneath his feet, and it wasn't from the storm-tossed seas. "Nuclear materials?" "Commander, I swear to you on my honor as a naval officer that I had no knowledge of any such cargo." Someone used me, and my crew, and put us all in danger without our knowledge or consent. The gravity of the situation was settling over everyone aboard the Sea Breeze like a suffocating blanket. If weapons-grade nuclear materials were indeed in the cargo hold, then every person on both ships was potentially in mortal danger. More importantly, if these materials were intended for terrorists or hostile nations, then a catastrophic threat to global security was currently floating in a storm-tossed cargo hold. "Sir," Santos approached cautiously, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand the seriousness of their situation, "there's something else you should know. About an hour before the patrol boat appeared, we started getting some unusual readings on our radiation detection equipment. I thought it was just interference from the storm." Morrison spun toward the first mate. "Your vessel has radiation detection equipment?" "Standard safety gear for any ship carrying medical supplies," Santos explained. "Some medical isotopes can be dangerous if containment is breached, so we monitor for leaks as a routine precaution." The commander was already reaching for his radio. Morrison to Swift Current. "We have confirmation of nuclear materials aboard the target vessel. Implement radiation protocols immediately and contact base for a hazmat team. This situation just became a potential national security emergency." As Morrison coordinated with his own vessel, Thompson stood watching the storm clouds continue to build overhead. The rain was coming down harder now, and the seas were becoming increasingly rough. He realized that even if they could safely remove the nuclear materials from his ship, they still had to deal with the practical problem of being caught in increasingly dangerous weather. "Commander," Thompson called out, raising his voice over the growing wind, "we need to think about the immediate safety situation here. This storm is getting worse, and conducting a radiation cleanup operation in heavy seas is going to be extremely dangerous for everyone involved." Morrison paused in his radio communications, recognizing the validity of Thompson's concern. The mission to secure the nuclear materials was critical, but not if it resulted in the deaths of the people trying to accomplish it. He looked around at the deteriorating conditions and made a tactical decision. "Swift Current, we need to find shelter before this storm gets any worse. Can you plot a course to the nearest safe harbor where we can continue this operation under controlled conditions?" As the two naval officers worked to coordinate their response to both the security threat and the weather emergency, Dr. Chen aboard the Deep Explorer was making preparations of her own. Through her surveillance equipment, she had observed enough of the situation to understand that nuclear materials were involved, and her mission had just taken on a new urgency. "Captain Rodriguez," she called out, "I need you to move us within radio range of those vessels. I have information that could be crucial to what's happening over there." Rodriguez looked at her passenger with new interest. "Information about what, exactly?" "About who's really behind this situation, and why those materials are exactly where certain people wanted them to be." Dr. Chen's expression was grim. "I'm afraid Captain Thompson and his crew aren't the criminals here, they're victims of a much larger conspiracy, one that I've been tracking for months." The revelation that Dr. Chen had been conducting her own investigation into the very situation now unfolding added yet another layer of complexity to an already dangerous scenario. As the three vessels continued to battle the increasingly rough seas, each group was beginning to realize that they were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. Thompson found himself caught in the middle of forces he didn't fully understand. Morrison was dealing with a security threat that might be part of a deliberate setup, and Dr. Chen was watching months of careful investigation come to a head in the worst possible circumstances. The storm raging around them seemed almost secondary to the human tempest of conflicting interests and hidden agendas that was building to its own climax. As lightning began to flash across the darkening sky, each person involved in this maritime drama was about to discover that their understanding of the situation was about to change dramatically. The nuclear materials in the cargo hold were just the beginning of a story that reached into the highest levels of government and military command, a story that would test the loyalty, courage, and integrity of everyone caught in its web. The Sea Breeze continued to rock in the increasingly violent seas, her cargo hold containing enough radioactive material to poison an entire city, while three different groups of people worked desperately to understand how they had all ended up in the same place at the same time, facing the same terrible threat. The storm was reaching its full fury when Dr. Chen's voice crackled across the emergency radio frequency, cutting through the static and chaos that had engulfed all three vessels. Her transmission reached both the sea breeze and the swift currents simultaneously, though her words were initially met with confusion and skepticism. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen aboard the research vessel Deep Explorer. I'm transmitting on emergency frequencies because I have critical information about the nuclear materials you've discovered aboard the merchant vessel. Commander Morrison, Captain Thompson, you're both in immediate danger, but not from the materials themselves." Morrison grabbed his radio handset, his patience wearing thin as he tried to coordinate multiple crisis responses simultaneously. "Unknown vessel, identify yourself properly and state the nature of your information. We're dealing with a potential nuclear terrorism situation here." "Commander," Dr. Chen's voice came back steady and clear despite the storm interference. "The nuclear materials in Captain Thompson's cargo hold are not weapons grade, and they're not intended for terrorists. They're evidence in a corruption investigation that reaches into the highest levels of military procurement. Someone wants those materials to disappear, and they're using you to make it happen." Thompson felt a cold realization washing over him that had nothing to do with the storm soaking his clothes. "Dr. Chen, this is Captain Thompson. Are you saying my old Navy contact set me up?" "Not exactly, Captain. Your contact, Commander William Harrison, was trying to preserve evidence of illegal weapons material sales. The containers in your hold contain samples that prove several high-ranking officers have been selling legitimate military nuclear materials to private contractors who then resell them on the black market." Morrison's radio crackled as he processed this information. Commander Harrison, that was the same name as the officer who had supposedly ordered this interception. But the voice that had given those orders hadn't identified his vessel correctly, and now Morrison was beginning to understand why. "Dr. Chen," Morrison's voice was tight with growing suspicion, "who exactly ordered this interception of the sea breeze?" "That's what I've been trying to warn you about, Commander. The real Commander Harrison is dead. He was murdered 3 days ago after he discovered the full extent of the corruption ring. Someone has been using his identity and authority to orchestrate this entire situation." The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. If Dr. Chen was correct, then his mission to intercept the sea breeze had been issued by someone impersonating a naval officer. That meant whoever had sent him was working to cover up the very crimes that the nuclear evidence was meant to expose. "Sir," came the voice of Petty Officer Chang from the cargo hold, "I've completed the analysis of these materials. Dr. Chen is correct, these aren't weapons-grade isotopes. They appear to be samples from various military facilities, with documentation showing they were supposed to have been destroyed years ago." Thompson leaned against the ship's railing, rain streaming down his face as the pieces of a larger conspiracy began to fall into place. "Morrison, the person who contacted me using Harrison's name, he knew exactly how to appeal to my loyalty. He knew details about my service record that only someone with access to classified files would know. Captain Rodriguez," Dr. Chen called to her own vessel's skipper, "we need to get closer to those ships. I need to transfer to the sea breeze to help them understand what they're really dealing with." Rodriguez looked at the storm-lashed seas between their position and the other vessels. "Dr. Chen, attempting a transfer in these conditions would be suicide. Can't this wait until the weather improves?" "Unfortunately, no. The people behind this conspiracy won't wait for good weather to clean up their loose ends. If we don't act now, everyone aboard both of those vessels could be in mortal danger." As if summoned by her words, Morrison's radio suddenly erupted with an urgent transmission from his own vessel, "Swift current to boarding party. We have multiple contacts approaching from the southeast. 3 vessels, military configuration, not responding to identification requests." Morrison felt his blood turn to ice. "Rodriguez," he called to his ship's captain, "are those vessels part of our operation?" "Negative, Commander. All our units are accounted for. These vessels are not part of any authorized mission." The situation was deteriorating rapidly beyond anyone's ability to control it. What had started as a routine interception was now revealed to be part of a conspiracy involving murdered naval officers, stolen nuclear materials, and corrupt military officials. And now, unidentified military vessels were approaching their position in the middle of a storm. "Dr. Chen's voice cut through the radio chatter once again. Commander Morrison, those approaching vessels are there to sink both your ship and the sea breeze. They'll claim it was a storm casualty, and the evidence will go down with the ships." "How can you possibly know that?" Morrison demanded. "Because I've been tracking this corruption ring for 8 months. I know who's involved, how they operate, and what they're willing to do to protect themselves. Commander William Harrison contacted me 2 weeks before his death because he needed someone outside the military chain of command to help expose what he'd discovered." Thompson listened to this exchange while watching his crew secure the deck equipment against the storm. The irony wasn't lost on him that while they were fighting to protect his ship from the weather, a much more deadly threat was approaching from human enemies who wanted to ensure none of them survived to tell their story. "Dr. Chen," Thompson called over the radio, "if what you're saying is true, then we need more than just your word to convince anyone in authority. Do you have proof of this conspiracy?" "I have everything, Captain. Documents, recorded conversations, financial records showing the illegal sales, and, most importantly, I have the real Commander Harrison's final report. He completed his investigation before they killed him, and he made sure to get the evidence to someone they couldn't reach." Morrison was coordinating with his own crew while trying to process the rapid developments. "All right, Dr. Chen, assuming you're telling the truth about all of this, what do you suggest we do? We're caught in a storm with hostile vessels approaching, and we're responsible for securing nuclear materials that apparently everyone wants to either steal or destroy. First, we need to get those sample containers off the sea breeze and onto my research vessel. The Deep Explorer has better containment facilities and more sophisticated communication equipment. Second, we need to get a message to Admiral Patricia Sterling at Naval Intelligence. She's been conducting a parallel investigation into missing nuclear materials, and she's one of the few people in command position we can trust." At the mention of Admiral Sterling's name, Thompson felt a spark of recognition. He'd served under Sterling early in his career when she was just a captain. She was known throughout the fleet as an officer of uncompromising integrity, someone who would pursue the truth regardless of how uncomfortable it made her superiors. "I know Admiral Sterling," Thompson announced. "If she's investigating this situation, then we can trust her completely. But Dr. Chen is right about getting off this ship. If hostile forces are approaching, the sea breeze is going to be their primary target." Morrison was rapidly calculating tactical options. His patrol boat was fast and well armed, but it wasn't equipped for a prolonged engagement against multiple vessels. The research ship might offer better protection and communication capabilities, but transferring nuclear materials between ships in a storm was extraordinarily dangerous. "Dr. Chen, what's your vessel's defensive capability?" "We're not armed, Commander, but we have something better. We have the truth, and we have the communication equipment to broadcast it to the entire fleet if necessary. Once Admiral Sterling receives our evidence, those approaching vessels will find themselves facing court-martial proceedings instead of target practice." The wind was howling now with hurricane force, and all 3 vessels were struggling to maintain position in the mountainous seas. Lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes, and, in those brief moments of clarity, the approaching hostile vessels could be seen closing the distance with ominous intent. Santos approached Thompson on the bridge, shouting to be heard over the storm. "Captain, the crew wants to know what's happening. They deserve to understand the danger they're in." Thompson nodded grimly. His crew had signed on for a humanitarian mission, not to become targets in a conspiracy involving nuclear materials and corrupt military officers. They deserved to know the truth, even if that truth was more terrifying than anything they could have imagined. "Attention all hands," Thompson announced over the ship's intercom system. "This is your captain. We've discovered that our cargo contains evidence of crimes committed by corrupt military officials. Hostile forces are approaching our position with the intent to destroy this evidence and everyone who's seen it. We're going to transfer the evidence to a research vessel and contact Naval Intelligence. I won't lie to you, we're all in danger, but we're going to get through this together." The honesty of Thompson's announcement seemed to galvanize his crew rather than panic them. These were experienced mariners who had faced storms and emergencies before. Knowing the truth, however dangerous, was better than operating in ignorance. As the 3 vessels continued to battle the storm and prepare for the approaching threat. Each person involved was beginning to understand that they had become part of something much larger than themselves. The evidence in the cargo hold of the Seabreeze could expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of military command, but only if they could survive long enough to deliver it to the right people. The storm raged on, but now it seemed almost secondary to the human tempest that was about to break over all of them. The transfer operation between the three vessels in storm-tossed seas was one of the most dangerous maneuvers any of them had ever attempted. Dr. Chen had insisted on personally overseeing the movement of the nuclear evidence containers, and, somehow, Captain Rodriguez had managed to bring the Deep Explorer close enough to the Seabreeze for the transfer to be possible, though barely. Morrison watched through binoculars as his team worked to secure the containers in waterproof transport cases. The approaching hostile vessels were now clearly visible on radar, less than 10 nautical miles away and closing fast despite the brutal weather conditions. Whatever orders they were operating under were important enough for them to risk their own vessels in the storm. "Commander," Chang called out as she supervised the loading of the final container, "we've got everything secured and ready for transfer." "But, sir, I need to tell you something about these materials." "What is it, Chang?" "The documentation with these samples, it shows they came from at least 6 different military installations, all supposedly destroyed according to official records. If someone's been selling these materials instead of destroying them, we're looking at potentially hundreds of nuclear devices worth of material that's unaccounted for." Morrison felt the full weight of the conspiracy settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about covering up a few illegal sales, this was about a systematic looting of America's nuclear stockpile by people in positions of ultimate trust. Aboard the Deep Explorer, Dr. Chen was making final preparations for what she knew would be the most important transmission of her career. The communication array on the research vessel was powerful enough to reach naval intelligence directly, bypassing any potentially compromised channels in the regular command structure. "Captain Rodriguez, are you certain this transmission will reach Admiral Sterling directly?" "Dr. Chen, our communication setup was specifically designed for deep ocean research that requires immediate contact with shore-based authorities. If Admiral Sterling is where she's supposed to be, she'll get this message." Dr. Chen took a deep breath and activated the transmission. "Admiral Sterling, this is Dr. Sarah Chen transmitting from research vessel Deep Explorer. I have urgent information regarding the missing nuclear materials investigation. Commander William Harrison completed his investigation before his death, and we now have physical evidence proving systematic theft of military nuclear stockpiles by corrupt officers. We also have evidence proving Commander Harrison was murdered to prevent him from exposing this conspiracy." The static-filled response came back within minutes, cutting through the storm interference with startling clarity. "Dr. Chen, this is Admiral Sterling. I've been expecting your contact. We've been monitoring unusual military movements in your area. Are you currently under threat?" "Yes, Admiral. 3 unidentified military vessels are approaching our position with hostile intent. They appear to be attempting to destroy the evidence and eliminate witnesses." There was a brief pause before Admiral Sterling's voice returned, now carrying the full authority of her rank. "Dr. Chen, maintain your position and protect that evidence at all costs. I'm dispatching a full carrier battle group to your coordinates. Any vessel that fires upon you will be considered to be engaged in an act of treason against the United States." The transmission cut out momentarily as another lightning strike interfered with the communications, but, when it resumed, Admiral Sterling's voice carried new urgency. "Dr. Chen, I need you to identify yourself properly to Commander Morrison. Show him your real credentials. He needs to understand who you really are." Dr. Chen hesitated for only a moment before reaching into her jacket and pulling out a leather credential case. When she opened it, the gold shield inside gleamed even in the storm's dim light. She was not just a marine biologist, she was a naval criminal investigative service agent who had been working undercover for nearly a year. "Commander Morrison," she called over the radio, "I'm transmitting my real identification now. NCIS Agent Sarah Chen, badge number 2847. I've been investigating this corruption ring under deep cover, and Commander Harrison was my primary contact inside the military structure." Morrison studied the transmitted credentials on his secure communication device. "Everything checked out, Dr. Chen was indeed a federal agent, and her investigation had been authorized at the highest levels of naval intelligence. Agent Chen, Morrison replied, if you're NCIS, then why didn't you identify yourself earlier? Because until Admiral Sterling confirmed it was safe, I couldn't be certain that you weren't part of the conspiracy. The corruption reaches high enough that even naval officers with impeccable records could potentially be compromised. Thompson listened to this exchange while watching his crew complete the transfer of the evidence containers to the research vessel. The revelation that Dr. Chen was a federal agent explained her detailed knowledge of the conspiracy, but it also meant that the situation was even more serious than he'd realized. Agent Chen, Thompson called over the radio, those approaching vessels, do you know who's commanding them? Captain Thompson, based on our intelligence, they're being led by Captain Richard Vance, who's been the primary coordinator of the illegal sales. He's desperate enough to risk open attack on naval vessels because he knows that exposure means life in prison for treason. The hostile vessels were now close enough that their details were becoming visible through the storm. Morrison could see that they were well-armed patrol boats, similar to his own Swift Current but configured more heavily for combat operations. If they engaged, the battle would be brief but devastating. All vessels, this is Admiral Sterling, came the transmission that cut through all other radio traffic. I am ordering all ships in the immediate area to stand down and identify themselves properly. Any vessel that fails to comply will be considered hostile and will be engaged by my battle group, which is currently 20 minutes from your position. For a moment, the radio waves went silent except for the crash of static that accompanied the storm. Then, a new voice came on the frequency, cold and calculating, Admiral Sterling, this is Captain Vance. I think you're bluffing. Your battle group is too far away to help these vessels, and, by the time you arrive, there will be nothing left but wreckage that can be explained by the storm. Captain Vance, Admiral Sterling's voice carried a tone that would have frozen lava, you are hereby relieved of command and ordered to surrender yourself for arrest on charges of treason, murder, and conspiracy. Stand down immediately. Vance's bitter laugh crackled over the radio. I don't think so, Admiral. Too much is at stake here, and too many people are involved for you to clean this up quietly. We're going to finish this operation, and you're going to have to live with the consequences. Morrison realized that negotiations had just ended and combat was about to begin. All hands, prepare for engagement, he ordered his crew. We're about to be attacked by hostile forces, and our job is to protect the evidence and the people carrying it. Agent Chen's voice cut through the preparations. All vessels, I'm uploading the complete evidence files to Admiral Sterling's battle group via an encrypted transmission. Even if we don't survive this engagement, the truth will reach the proper authorities. Thompson watched as the hostile vessels began to spread out into attack formation despite the storm conditions. Captain Vance was apparently willing to risk everything rather than face justice for his crimes. The irony wasn't lost on Thompson that some of the most dangerous enemies his country faced wore its own uniform. Agent Chen, Thompson called out, regardless of what happens in the next few minutes, I want you to know that my crew and I are honored to have played a part in exposing this conspiracy. Commander Harrison died for this truth, and we're ready to fight for it. As the first shots were fired across the storm-lashed seas, each person involved in this maritime battle knew that they were fighting for more than just their own lives. They were fighting for the integrity of the military they had sworn to serve, and for the safety of a nation whose nuclear arsenal had been systematically plundered by the very people trusted to protect it. The battle was joined as lightning continued to flash overhead, illuminating a scene that would be remembered as one of the most significant naval engagements in the fight against corruption within America's own military forces. The storm provided cover and chaos in equal measure, but it could not hide the truth that was now racing toward Admiral Sterling's battle group and the highest levels of government. In the end, the weather that had seemed like such a threat had become an ally, providing the time and cover necessary for the truth to be transmitted and preserved. The conspiracy that had cost Commander Harrison his life was about to be exposed, thanks to the courage of people who chose to risk everything rather than let injustice prevail. As Admiral Sterling's battle group appeared on the horizon, Captain Vance realized that his gambit had failed. The evidence of the nuclear material theft conspiracy was now in the hands of people who could not be bought, intimidated, or silenced. The storm was passing, both literally and figuratively, and a new dawn was about to break over a military that would have to confront its own corruption and emerge stronger for having done so. The sea breeze, the swift current, and the deep explorer had all played their part in one of the most important victories in the ongoing battle for military integrity and national security. The truth, like the storm, had been powerful enough to change everything in its path.